So first, why we're talking about this. Beatdapp's the market leader in fraud detection. You've probably seen a lot of cases recently in the news about fraudsters getting caught. We've been working on this really since the beginning of 2018. We accidentally discovered the problem when we were building an audit product, and then started really building massive amounts of machine learning models to identify streaming anomalies. As of today, we've analyzed over 36 trillion events. So when we work with streaming services, we're getting everything from battery life, gyroscope, orientation of phone when it's playing, everything you've done in-app when you're playing a song, and we're analyzing all of those user behaviors to identify who's fraudulent and who's legitimate. And so far this year, we've analyzed over 3 trillion streams, so a huge portion of the market globally. Asia specifically is rapidly growing, as we all know. China's music streaming market is projected to grow by 9.4%. And with that comes a lot of bots, fraudulent streaming, and manipulation for financial gain. It's important to state that 80% of the fraud we catch is not from the music industry. This is not artists trying to juice their numbers. This isn't a label trying to make more money. These are professional scammers, financial scammers, organized crime, terrorist groups. These people are using the music industry's huge pot of money to either launder or make money in schemes of their own. And it directly impacts all the other artists that are part of this system and everyone in the supply chain and the ecosystem. So I'm going to go into like how we do some of the fraud detection, go into some specific cases for everybody. The first thing that we do, and one approach we take, is something called network analysis. We look for coordinated fraudulent streaming, so how connected are each user, device, and in this case what you're looking at, the clusters of purple are actually devices or users' devices, and the little yellow dots are the artists themselves. And we look for fraudulent streams specifically and then cluster them together. So the more densely connected the cluster, the more densely connected all the fraudulent users and artists are in that cluster. So it helps identify who's misbehaving within the entire scheme. One of the most obvious cases is if you come over here and look at this circle that's circled right here, and it blows up in the box. When they're on their own isolated island, it's a cluster that's those users are only listening to those small number of artists. So that is like a closed ecosystem. They've created an entire fraud bot network. They're only targeting specific artists, where normally if they were part of the much larger network, you don't just listen to 4 artists, right? Like any individual user will listen to all kinds of music from all over the place. And so it's very abnormal to have a group of users behaving in this way. And those are the most easy ones to spot on the outsides, those clusters that are kind of solo by themselves. They look like islands. So we'll go into how some of these look. In this case, we actually found, this is a small bot network cluster that we found. They had 112 users specifically in December 2023. That moved to 440 users in January 2024. They only accounted for about 6 million streams collectively between December and January, but it's a really good use case to show you what they're actually doing. So the artists that were shared had identical stream counts. They had streamed for some of the same countries. And the artist listeners, they had the same play patterns for both months, and a mix of artists that they streamed was almost exactly the same. So here's an actual breakdown. Here's the 4 artists out of that cluster that we detected. And when you zoom in, you can see that the users, so if you look at artist 3 and artist 4, each one of those numbers is a user down the side, 1 through 10, and that's the exact number of plays. And you can see that they're almost identical across every user underneath it. You also notice that the locations they're coming from are the same. Even just visually looking at the pie graph at the bottom, they're almost identical matched, right? Which would be really uncommon to have a bunch of users behaving the same way for 4 different artists. So that's a very telltale sign. Then you look at their top user from each artist, and you can see that they have the same play distribution. So especially the first 3, their number 1 artist they played exactly 1,552 times. You can see that even though they're the same, they're targeting different artists, the users are behaving the same. And even if you just visually look at the map, the bar chart, that's their usage by day. You can see that they just turn the bot network off and then turn it back on. And so they have the same usage pattern across users. This is a case specific for Vietnam that I just thought I'd throw in here since we're in the APAC region. we recently caught this case. They had 470,000 fraudulent streams, only across 138 paid users, but they had 112,000 unpaid free users. So collectively over 100,000 user bot network, which is showing you that they're not playing that many streams per song or per user. They're really trying to spread it out and have the lowest amount of streams they can across a wide net of users to go undetected. What's interesting is that in this case, we could tell exactly which cities they were trying to manipulate because we get all the city level data from the user accounts from the streaming services as well. So we could tell exactly where in the country it's coming from. This one's really dumb because they only targeted one artist. So imagine having a bunch of devices that only target one artist in a lonely little island. This is like the most obvious case of fraud. This would be like if you had, let's say, 400 different accounts only playing your song over and over and over and over again. Like that would be its own island. Those are really, really obvious and easy to detect. I call that like kindergarten fraud because that's normally where you start. It's not really that sophisticated yet. This is an interesting one because they used a tablet specifically. So this wrapper had unusually high tablet Android rates. Normally you don't see, we get device type, we can tell exactly what type of tablet it's from. And in this case, it's really interesting because it's a tablet we didn't recognize. It's not very common. They were generating a bunch of streams in this case. And their plays was just all over the place. You could see that also the artists they were targeting all had the same exact sort of device breakdown, which is really unique. And when you looked at the underlying users, they were sharing 16 IP accounts. So kind of unusual to have that many shared accounts across what should be differentiated artists and users underneath it. Their breakdown of OS type was way too leaning Android heavy. That's really not common. Like we have our own we have our own markers for what's normal standard distribution of usage and also standard distribution of different platforms. So that was obviously a flag for us as well. And ultimately, what came out was this device was actually a device specifically made for the US Department of Corrections. And so it was part of a much larger scheme where we found hundreds of thousands of tablets where they had hacked the prison system in the United States. And they were using prison tablets to stream music and generate streams. So this one artist, while a small cluster, was indicative of much larger fraud that we found across 4 states and I believe 300,000 or 400,000 tablets. So to give you guys like an idea of the scope. Collateral damage. Unfortunately, a lot of your artists that you work with will be caught up in fraud schemes, whether they meant to or not. And the reason is if you're trying to create fraud, you need to make a haystack around your needle. I need to shield myself if I'm a fraudster and try and hide in plain sight. So what they'll do is they'll try to bury their networks in with a bunch of other users or artists so that it's really difficult to detect exactly who is the beneficiary ultimately of their fraud. So how do you know that it's this artist versus another artist if the same users are playing 400 artists, right? Because we can understand, because we have so much data and our models are so sophisticated, we can typically isolate not just everyone that was affected, but who the actual primary targets were. And so in this particular case that we'll go into, we actually found a number of artists that were being propped up out of all the collateral damage. So how this would look, artist A here is the fraudulent one, but they're gonna sit inside of a network and all the other yellow ones are other artists and the other purple ones are different devices. So they're gonna try and sit in the middle and look like they're part of the mix. Oh, like I got played with Lady Gaga because our music's similar. Like I got played with Cody Johnson because our music's similar. They're gonna sit in there and try to like hide themselves amongst other artists. This one case we're gonna go over, we found 35,000 accounts that were behaving this way in December 2023. And there was a bunch of benign users and a bunch, meaning like users that were regular users. And then there was 4 specific artists that were clearly being propped up by this network. So when we pulled it apart, we could identify who exactly was benefiting here. And what we noticed was that 89% of the 3 artists that were fraudulent, 89% of their plays were completely fake. And then 46% of the remaining artists' total plays were fraudulent. So the collateral damage was a significant amount of plays for other artists to hide what they were trying to do. So to make it simple, If I want to drive 1 million plays for myself for fraud, I'm probably driving 30 to 50 million plays for other artists. And all of those change the pro rata pool for how you're paid out, which dramatically impacts your sort of net revenue in the supply chain. So how did we catch this group? This is the 3 artists, the top 3 that were most similar. And what you have on the top is December, and what you have on the bottom is January. So if you look top to bottom, you can see they had all these plays in December, and then in January, they've got like no plays. The same, you go to artist number 2, the second one in the middle, tons of plays, no plays. Tons of plays, no plays. Really obvious, they turned the bot network off. Then you look at their device types. And so in this case, while they were running the fraud, they were mostly all Chrome. You could see that they were running Chrome and they were going web and Windows based. As soon as January hits, suddenly they're using the iOS app again. So the users completely changed. So when you look at the makeup of their users and how they consume the music, it also varied month to month. So as soon as the bot networks changed, the regular users were the only ones left, and they had a more normal distribution pattern. Now let's look at the artists they targeted. So these are benign artists. These are just artists that got caught in the fraud scheme. Month over month, their fans love them. They're still playing their music. But if you look really small at the bottom, the first artist lost 13% of their plays, the second artist 21%, and the third artist 17%. So this bot network was generating between 13 and 20% of regular artist plays for those 2 months. And they were trying to hide what they were doing in that mix. And if you weren't sophisticated, you would just blame these artists for participating in the fraud. And it's really about understanding that they aren't actually the intended target, they're just being used as collateral damage. And that's part of the work that we do is not just finding fraud, but eliminating the false positives and telling our partners these artists shouldn't be touched. These artists aren't at fault here, they were just used. And when you look at that, the legitimate artists, the user playdown, you notice that not much changes. iOS, a little bit of Android, some Windows, but the makeup is exactly what you would expect, and they weren't affected. And the reason it's like this is even if the fraudulent users pumped a lot of streams, they have real users propping them up. So you're not going to see their entire makeup of all their users switch to Windows because they still have legitimate fans playing their music. This was an interesting Chinese case. This is from a streaming platform, and it had 3 tiers, a free tier, a low paid tier, and a high paid tier. And what we found across all these fraudulent artists that we caught was that the exact same percentage of their users were split amongst the tiers. So 0 on free, 15% on low, and 85% on the low tier, let's call it $5, and 15% on the high tier. And that was their attempt at trying to make it look like they were diversified, that these were real users who were paying, but they were paying for accounts to then bot their specific users. Again, you could see that they were using an OS that isn't normal, not one that you would, operating system that you wouldn't regularly see. And they had the exact same even breakdown, which is really abnormal to have these types of tiers working in concert like this for the artists. And then when you map them as a cluster, you look at just their fraudulent plays and how they interact together. And what you end up with is these blue bubbles, which are the nodes, which represent the artists. And every time that they're related to another artist through a fraudulent play, the red line is created, and the more of those that happen, the thicker the red line is that's generated in this graph. So what you end up with here is a giant fraud network hidden inside of the much larger artist network where they were hiding in plain sight, which is the green lines behind it. It's important to know that there's 2 ways for you to get hacked. There's account takeovers, which is basically credential stuffing is another word for it. So someone has your username and password and they log in as you. The other way is that you can just have your entire account infected, like you can have your entire computer infected. So on the dark web, there's approximately 40 million infected computers and devices currently that are tied to most of the major streaming platforms. And these users don't realize that their entire account or computer has been compromised. So you can actually spin up a bot, tell it to play streams that you want. There's actually an API on the dark web that'll let you tell, I need people in these countries with these types of accounts. It'll pick out of that database of users they've infected and then play your song a handful of times distributed to try and hide and go undetected. So you don't even have to do the hacking anymore because there's entire software layers to help you do that for you if you're a hacker as part of the supply chain system. Another way that they can do it is just add an account. So imagine you have a family plan and you only have two devices. They can just get your information and add a third device. So this case, the account takeover case that I'm going to show you, a device was added to their iOS and their Tesla. They were connected to their car, they were connected to their phone, and then someone else added an Android. So in the one on the left, that's the fraudulent one, you could see that all their plays were fraudulent and they were connected to an Android device. But when you look at the next set of their devices connected to their account, which was the Tesla and the iOS, they had almost no fraudulent plays, sub 5% of any detected artist that we considered fraud. And they were just normal, authentic, normal play counts, 99 plays, 114 plays versus 339. So this is a very common type of account takeover, or ATO, where they just attach new devices to your account and hope you don't notice. Another interesting thing we've started doing for platforms, especially CMOs and collection societies and publishers, is anyone that has a portal where people can like log in and use your platform, they also are susceptible for fraud. I like to describe it as a water balloon. As you squeeze one part, the other parts of fraud like bubble out the other direction. So while we've stopped fraud a lot of times on the streaming services, they start moving down the chain into collection societies, trying to get the publishing rights, trying to get their neighbor, like anything else they can get in the system that's left unprotected. And one way that we've developed kind of going after that is instead of looking at the core streaming unit itself, looking at how users behave on these platforms as a whole and identifying who's fraudulent and who's not. So in this case, the pink is the fraud and the purple is actually the regular users. And in this case, on the first top left corner here, they're checking in to see how many of their songs have been released from the library on that platform. So they're checking in every single day. They're signing in every day to say, is my song out there or not? Like a normal user will check to see if it's out there and then not check again. They're checking every day to see if they've been caught. So very different patterns for usage as soon as they're on the platform. And this is like a telltale sign across all these features. So every single box that you see is something else that a user could do on that platform. And you have very clear delineation between what like fraud and bots do and what a normal user does. And this helps us predict users on a platform, whether or not they're streaming or not, as to who's going to be fraudulent and who's not. And we often can predict ahead of time, let's say these 5,000 users are most likely fraud. You should put them through a different product flow. Ask them for more KYC, ask them to perform more steps, put more friction in their pathway on purpose. I've talked about this a little bit, but distributors have a pretty big problem right now, especially DIY high volume distributors. Fraudsters aren't just going to use one distributor. They're going to put music through as many pathways as they can and make sure there's not just one throat to choke or one point of possible failure. So in this case, over the last couple months, we've had over 50 distributors with over 50% of their streams are fraudulent. So obviously I pulled a case where these are the top 10, it's like 80%, but we sit across a number of streaming services, right? This isn't like a sample from one. This isn't like some small one. We have a number of publicly traded customers. We have, as I showed you earlier, trillions of streams you've looked at. So we're looking across a wide swath of the industry, and a number of the distributors, whether they know it or not, are being used as pipes for fraud. And these fraudsters are putting that music in. Once the music's uploaded on the streaming service, they're generating massive amounts of streams through bot networks, account takeover, stolen accounts, and they're stealing revenue that would have otherwise gone to all the artists, managers, distributors, labels, everyone in the supply pipeline. It's a massive problem right now for distributors and one that hopefully will help them start tackling soon, but it's a gaping hole right now because there's not a lot of protections at that level. Recently, you might have seen a case in South Carolina. I just thought I'd bring it up. There was a $10 million indictment for a man in South Carolina who approximately put 206,000 songs up and then ran a bunch of bots and stole $10 million over 2 years. It was famous because he, I guess infamous recently, because he used AI to generate those songs. So they were AI generated music that he uploaded through various distributors and then defrauded the system with. He generated 661,000 streams per day and used a variety of fake accounts and VPNs to hide what he was doing and stole roughly $10 million from the industry. Now, this is a really interesting case, not because it's hard or sophisticated. This is baby fraud. This fraud is the fraud that we catch every day that no one talks about. This is a minor, like in terms of like sophistication. Obviously, it's a big amount of money, but the importance here is the precedent it'll set. When this gets prosecuted, then we can go after the much larger, more sophisticated cases, because this largely rode off of terms and services and bot accounts, and I think there's a pretty big legal gray area that needs to be articulated and refined. And so this case will help do that so that we can start prosecuting the number of other cases that are in the pipeline. So it's a landmark case because I think it's going to open the floodgates for prosecution and enforcement in a way that never has been allowed before. But in terms of sophistication, this is not a sophisticated type of fraud. We see massively more sophisticated networks on a daily basis, money laundering from cartels, terrorist groups moving money across jurisdictions, all kinds of crazy things. It's not just to make money, sometimes it's washing money and moving money cross-border. It's a big problem for us. So that's it. I think I ended 6 minutes early, and thank you for the time.